Trying to overpower your own mind is one of the fastest ways to lose control of it. Every anxious thought you wrestle with seems to return stronger. Every fear you try to bury finds another way to surface. It is like trying to smooth the surface of water with your hands. The harder you struggle, the more disturbed it becomes. Stoicism points in a different direction. It teaches that peace is not found by forcing the mind into silence, but by learning to observe it without becoming its prisoner. Positive thinking is not blind optimism. It is the discipline of shaping your inner world with wisdom, because the way you interpret life quietly becomes the life you experience. Most people believe reality changes first and the mind follows. The Stoics believed the opposite. Long before your circumstances change, your perception begins deciding what you notice, what you fear, what you pursue, and what you believe is possible. Two people can face the same setback and walk away with entirely different futures, not because life treated them differently, but because each mind assigned a different meaning to the same event. The event never changed. The interpretation did. From that moment, two completely different realities begin to unfold. That invisible process shapes far more than emotions. It influences every decision you make, every opportunity you recognize, and every challenge you either avoid or overcome. Most people spend their lives trying to change the world around them, while never realizing that the lens through which they see the world has been guiding them all along. The Stoics understood that lasting transformation does not begin with circumstances. It begins with perception. Change the way you see the world, and over time, the world you experience begins to change with it. From the moment your eyes open, your mind has already begun arranging the world into a familiar pattern. Before your feet touch the floor, it quietly recalls yesterday's worries, unfinished conversations, and imagined possibilities. It predicts how the morning will feel before the morning has truly begun. It decides whether the day will be difficult before a single challenge has appeared. This process happens with such speed that it rarely attracts your attention. It feels natural, almost invisible, and because it feels natural, it is often mistaken for truth. Yet the Stoics understood something remarkably profound. The mind does not simply observe reality, it interprets it. Between every event and every emotional reaction lies a judgment, and within that judgment rests the power to shape an entire day, an entire year, sometimes even an entire life. Modern psychology describes this tendency through cognitive biases, explaining that the brain constantly filters information according to what it already expects to find. The Stoics reached a similar conclusion centuries earlier, though they spoke in the language of perception and reason rather than neuroscience. They believed people are disturbed less by circumstances than by the opinions they form about those circumstances. This is not an invitation to deny pain or pretend difficulty does not exist. Rather, it is a reminder that two people can stand before the same obstacle and leave with entirely different conclusions, because each mind has assigned a different meaning to the same experience. The event remains unchanged, yet the reality each person lives begins to separate the moment interpretation takes over. Think about how often expectations quietly rewrite the present. Someone who believes rejection is inevitable notices every delayed reply, every distracted glance, every brief silence as confirmation that they are being dismissed. Another person experiences those exact same moments without attaching the same meaning. The facts remain identical, but the emotional world becomes completely different. This is how the mind slowly constructs reality. It gathers pieces of information that support its existing beliefs while overlooking everything that challenges them. Without realizing it, people become investigators searching for evidence to prove a conclusion they accepted long ago. Eventually, they stop asking whether the story is true, because they have collected enough examples to convince themselves it must be. The danger is not that the mind creates stories. The danger is forgetting they are stories. A single embarrassing moment becomes proof that speaking up is dangerous. One betrayal quietly transforms into the belief that trust always leads to disappointment. A failed opportunity grows into the conviction that success belongs to someone else. None of these conclusions arrive overnight. They form gradually, strengthened by repetition rather than certainty. As Marcus Aurelius reminded himself, the soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts. Every time the same interpretation is repeated, it becomes easier for the mind to choose that path again. Like water carving a channel through stone, familiar thoughts begin requiring almost no effort at all. They become the default direction of attention, shaping perception before conscious awareness even has the opportunity to respond. This is why so many people feel trapped inside patterns they never deliberately created. They wake each morning believing they are responding to reality, when in many cases they are responding to expectations built months or even years earlier. The mind prefers familiarity over accuracy because familiarity feels safe. It would rather repeat a painful prediction that has proven consistent than entertain a hopeful possibility that feels uncertain. The Stoics recognized this tendency as one of the greatest obstacles to inner freedom. A person who cannot distinguish between events and interpretations slowly surrenders authority over their own experience. They become governed not by reality itself, but by assumptions about reality, many of which were formed during moments of fear, disappointment, or emotional exhaustion. Consider how this plays out in ordinary life. A conversation begins, and before the other person has finished speaking, your mind has already decided what they meant. A challenge appears at work, and your thoughts immediately calculate every possible way it could end badly. A mistake occurs, and instead of seeing one isolated event, the mind quietly adds it to a growing collection of evidence supporting an old belief about personal inadequacy. None of these reactions require conscious effort. They unfold automatically because repetition has transformed them into habits. Yet habits of thought deserve the same scrutiny as habits of behavior. Just because something happens effortlessly does not mean it deserves complete trust. Stoicism encourages a different relationship with the mind. Instead of believing every impression the moment it appears, it invites you to pause, not to suppress the thought, not to argue with it, simply to observe it before accepting its conclusion. That brief pause may seem insignificant, but it changes the entire process. Observation interrupts automatic judgment. It creates enough distance for reason to enter where impulse once dominated. Modern psychology often speaks about cognitive flexibility, the ability to examine thoughts without immediately identifying with them. The Stoics practiced this discipline long before the concept received a scientific name. They understood that freedom begins the moment a person realizes they can witness a thought without becoming its servant. At first, this awareness feels unfamiliar because the mind has spent years convincing you that every thought deserves immediate attention. It insists that every fear requires analysis, every criticism demands defense, and every uncertainty must be solved before peace can exist. Yet experience quietly teaches the opposite. Many fears disappear without becoming reality. Many imagined conflicts never occur. Many moments that once seemed unbearable eventually fade into distant memories. The mind often mistakes possibility for certainty and certainty for truth. Recognizing that tendency does not weaken your ability to navigate life. It strengthens it because your decisions become grounded in observation instead of assumption. As this way of seeing develops, something subtle begins to change. You no longer feel compelled to chase every thought that enters your awareness. You notice how quickly the mind rushes toward familiar conclusions, but you also recognize that familiarity is not proof. Gradually, your relationship with yourself becomes less reactive and more deliberate. You stop confusing the first interpretation with the only interpretation. That single shift changes more than your emotional state. It changes the choices you make, the risks you are willing to take, the conversations you enter with confidence instead of fear, and the opportunities you once ignored because an old story convinced you they were never meant for you. The world outside may look remarkably similar, yet the world within has already begun moving in an entirely different direction. Once you begin noticing that your mind does not simply observe reality, but constantly interprets it, something even more important comes into view. Those interpretations did not appear out of nowhere. They were built slowly, often long before you were aware they were being formed. Every disappointment left a small impression. Every success taught a lesson. Every criticism, every compliment, every expectation placed upon you added another layer to the invisible lens through which you now experience life. The remarkable part is that most of these lessons were accepted without question because they arrived during moments when the mind was searching for certainty rather than truth. Over time, those borrowed conclusions stopped feeling borrowed. They became part of your identity, quietly influencing your choices before you ever had the chance to examine whether they deserved such authority. If these ideas are helping you see your own mind a little more clearly, consider subscribing. It's about returning to timeless principles that help you think more clearly, live more intentionally, and understand yourself a little better with every conversation. A child who repeatedly hears that mistakes are unacceptable may eventually grow into an adult who fears every opportunity that carries uncertainty. Someone who receives affection only after achieving something impressive may slowly begin believing that worth must always be earned. Another person who grows up surrounded by constant conflict may come to expect tension even in peaceful situations, interpreting ordinary silence as hidden resentment and simple disagreements as signs that relationships are about to collapse. None of these patterns are consciously selected. They develop because the human mind is designed to recognize repetition and transform it into expectation. That ability helps people survive uncertain environments, yet it can also preserve beliefs that no longer belong in the present. The danger is not in learning from experience. The danger appears when experience quietly becomes a permanent definition of reality. Modern psychology explains this through mental schemas, deeply rooted patterns that help organize information quickly. The Stoics approached the same phenomenon from another direction. They believed that impressions arrive naturally, but wisdom begins when those impressions are examined instead of immediately accepted. Every thought deserves attention, but not every thought deserves agreement. That distinction sounds simple, yet it changes everything. The mind constantly presents conclusions with complete confidence, even when those conclusions are built upon incomplete evidence. It says, "This always happens." It says, "People never change." It says, "You are simply the kind of person who cannot succeed." These statements feel convincing because they are familiar, not because they are true. Repetition creates certainty, but certainty alone has never been proof. Consider how easily confirmation begins shaping perception. Someone convinced that people cannot be trusted notices every betrayal with perfect clarity, yet acts of kindness quickly disappear from memory because they do not fit the existing narrative. A person who believes failure is inevitable remembers every setback while quietly dismissing every accomplishment as luck or coincidence. Even praise becomes uncomfortable because it contradicts an identity built over many years. As Epictetus wisely observed, people are disturbed not by things, but by the views they take of them. The mind naturally protects the stories it already believes, often resisting evidence that might set it free. It is not trying to create suffering. It is trying to preserve consistency. Ironically, that search for consistency becomes the very thing that prevents growth. This explains why changing external circumstances often produces less transformation than expected. A new career may bring fresh opportunities, yet the old belief that success belongs to someone else quietly follows along. A healthier relationship may offer trust and stability, but the expectation of abandonment continues searching for signs that history is about to repeat itself. New surroundings cannot immediately erase old interpretations because the environment changed while perception remained familiar. The Stoics repeatedly reminded themselves that lasting peace could never depend entirely upon favorable conditions. Without examining the judgments carried into each experience, every new beginning eventually starts feeling like another version of the old story. The quiet influence of social conditioning makes these filters even stronger. Families, schools, workplaces, cultures, and communities all communicate subtle messages about what success should look like, what failure means, and who deserves acceptance. Many of those messages are valuable. Others quietly encourage comparison, perfectionism, or fear of rejection. After hearing the same expectations for years, people often mistake them for their own beliefs. They pursue goals they never truly desired, defend opinions they never consciously formed, and measure their lives using standards they never intentionally accepted. The voice inside the mind sometimes sounds personal, simply because it has been repeated so often. Yet familiarity should never be confused with authenticity. Recognizing this can feel uncomfortable because it asks you to question ideas that once provided certainty. That discomfort is not a sign that something has gone wrong. It is often evidence that awareness is expanding beyond automatic habit. The Stoics understood that freedom requires the courage to examine the beliefs hidden beneath emotional reactions. Anger may reveal an expectation, fear may uncover an assumption, envy may expose a definition of success that was accepted without reflection. Instead of condemning these emotions, they treated them as invitations to investigate the judgments supporting them. Every emotional response became an opportunity to understand the architecture of the mind more clearly. As this process continues, something subtle begins to shift. Old beliefs lose the authority they once held because they are finally being observed instead of blindly obeyed. The sentence, "This is simply who I am," slowly transforms into, "This is a story I have repeated for a long time." That single change creates space for new possibilities without requiring false optimism or forced confidence. It replaces unconscious certainty with thoughtful curiosity. The prison that once felt permanent begins revealing itself as a collection of assumptions built over time, and anything built can also be rebuilt. The walls were never made of reality itself. They were made of interpretations that quietly became habits. Habits that became expectations, and expectations that eventually convinced you they were facts. The moment those facts are questioned with honesty rather than fear, perception begins opening where it once remained closed, and genuine freedom finally finds room to grow from within. That realization can be uncomfortable because it quietly shifts the direction of responsibility. It suggests that the greatest obstacle is not always the circumstance standing in front of you, but the interpretation standing between you and that circumstance. Most people naturally look outward when something feels wrong. They search for a different environment, different relationships, different opportunities, believing that the next change will finally create the peace they have been chasing. Sometimes external change is necessary. Sometimes walking away is the wisest decision. Yet there are moments when every new beginning slowly starts resembling the last one, not because life refuses to change, but because the same patterns of thought arrive first and begin shaping the experience before reality has the chance to speak for itself. This is why people can move to a different city and still carry the same loneliness. They can begin a promising career and continue doubting their own abilities. They can enter healthier relationships while expecting the same disappointments that defined the previous ones. On the surface, everything appears different. Beneath the surface, very little has changed. The mind quietly recreates familiar emotional landscapes because familiarity feels safer than uncertainty, even when that familiarity produces suffering. It is an unusual paradox. People often long for transformation while unconsciously protecting the very habits that prevent it. They believe they are escaping the past, yet they continue interpreting the present through the same invisible lens that was formed years earlier. That examination begins with something surprisingly small. A pause. Not a dramatic moment of enlightenment, not an instant transformation, just a brief interruption between an event and the meaning immediately attached to it. Most emotional reactions happen so quickly that they appear inseparable from reality itself. Someone speaks with a serious tone, and the mind concludes they are disappointed. A plan changes unexpectedly, and the mind predicts failure. A mistake happens, and the mind quietly whispers that nothing will ever improve. The conclusion arrives almost instantly, followed by emotion, followed by behavior. The entire sequence unfolds in seconds, leaving little room for reflection. Yet the Stoics trained themselves to recognize that the first interpretation is only an impression, not a verdict. That single distinction changes more than it first appears. Once an impression is seen as something that can be observed, instead of automatically believed, space begins to open where there was once only reaction. Within that space lives choice. The event remains exactly the same, but your relationship with it starts becoming more deliberate. Instead of racing towards certainty, you become curious about your own conclusions. Instead of asking whether a thought feels convincing, you begin asking whether it is actually supported by reality. Those questions do not weaken confidence. They protect it from becoming dependent upon assumptions that were never examined. Modern psychology often describes this process as creating distance from automatic thinking. The Stoics practiced it as a discipline of reason. Different language, yet the same principle emerges. Awareness interrupts momentum. The mind loses some of its ability to pull you into familiar emotional patterns because those patterns are finally being noticed instead of unconsciously repeated. This does not mean difficult emotions disappear overnight. Fear still appears, frustration still visits, doubt still speaks. The difference is that these experiences stop acting like unquestionable authorities. They become signals rather than commands, visitors rather than permanent residents. That subtle change gradually reshapes the entire inner landscape. Gradually, the question itself begins changing. Instead of asking, "Why does this always happen to me?" the mind starts asking, "Why does this event produce the same interpretation every time?" That shift may seem subtle, but it redirects attention toward the only place where lasting influence is possible. Circumstances cannot always be controlled. Other people cannot always be understood. Outcomes cannot always be predicted. Yet perception can continually be refined. Each moment of reflection becomes another opportunity to loosen the grip of an old story and replace unconscious reaction with deliberate understanding. That is where genuine transformation quietly begins. It does not arrive through dramatic external change or sudden certainty. It begins with the courage to observe your own mind honestly, to recognize that the lens through which you see the world has been shaping far more than you realized, and to understand that changing the lens is often the first step toward changing the life reflected through it. As that new question becomes part of your thinking, something begins to shift that cannot always be seen from the outside. Life may continue presenting uncertainty, unexpected setbacks, and moments that test your patience, yet your relationship with those moments slowly changes. The need to predict every outcome loses some of its urgency. The desire to control every possibility begins to fade. In its place comes something quieter, but far more dependable. Clarity. Not the certainty that nothing difficult will happen, but the confidence that you can meet whatever happens without allowing it to immediately take control of your inner world. That distinction is subtle, yet it marks the beginning of genuine self-mastery. The Stoics never promised a life free from hardship. They offered something much more valuable, a mind capable of remaining steady even when circumstances refuse to cooperate. Much of human suffering comes from demanding guarantees that life has never promised. The mind desperately wants certainty because certainty feels safe. It wants to know that every effort will succeed, every relationship will last, every decision will lead to the right destination. When those guarantees cannot be found, anxiety quickly steps in to create its own version of preparation. It begins imagining countless futures, convincing itself that if every possible problem is rehearsed in advance, disappointment will somehow hurt less. Yet the opposite often happens. Instead of protecting peace, the mind spends precious energy preparing for experiences that never arrive. Days become consumed by possibilities that exist only in imagination, while the reality unfolding in the present quietly passes unnoticed. None of this requires pretending painful experiences do not exist. Stoicism has never asked people to become emotionally numb or indifferent to loss. Grief remains real. Disappointment remains real. Failure remains real. The difference lies in refusing to let temporary emotion define permanent truth. Feeling discouraged after a setback is human. Concluding that the future is hopeless because of one setback is interpretation. Feeling hurt by criticism is natural. Deciding that criticism defines your worth is judgment. These distinctions appear small at first, yet they gradually transform the way the mind processes every experience. Reality becomes clearer because it is no longer constantly filtered through exaggerated emotional conclusions. After enough moments of quiet observation, a change begins taking place that is difficult to explain until it is experienced. Nothing dramatic happens overnight. The world does not suddenly become easier. People do not stop disappointing you. Obstacles do not disappear. The unexpected continues arriving without permission, yet something inside responds differently. The same situations that once immediately pulled you into frustration, fear, or self-doubt begin losing some of their influence. It is not because life has become more generous. It is because your relationship with life has become more deliberate. As Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." The Stoics understood that genuine strength rarely appears as an external victory. More often, it reveals itself through an internal shift so subtle that no one else notices it until its effects begin shaping every decision you make. Consider how often criticism once felt deeply personal. A single comment could linger in your thoughts for hours or even days. You replayed every word, searching for hidden meanings, questioning your abilities, wondering whether one opinion somehow erased everything you had accomplished. The emotional weight did not come from the words alone. It came from the story built around them. The criticism became evidence that you were not enough, that you had failed, or that your worth depended upon constant approval. As awareness grows, that automatic story begins losing its authority. Criticism still has the power to sting, but it also becomes information. Sometimes it reveals something useful. Sometimes it reflects another person's perspective rather than an objective truth. Sometimes it deserves attention, and sometimes it deserves to be released. Learning the difference protects both humility and peace. The same shift begins happening with failure. Earlier in life, failure often appeared as a final verdict, a clear statement about identity rather than one temporary outcome. Missing an opportunity felt like becoming someone incapable of success. A rejected application seemed to define the future instead of simply describing one moment in time. The Stoics refused to give events that kind of authority. They judged actions according to effort, integrity, and wisdom rather than immediate results. Modern psychology reaches a similar conclusion by showing that resilient people tend to interpret setbacks as temporary and specific rather than permanent and personal. Different traditions describe the process in different ways, yet both point toward the same quiet truth. The meaning assigned to an event determines how much power that event continues holding over your life. This becomes especially clear during moments of delay. Few experiences test the mind more consistently than waiting for an answer, waiting for progress, waiting for change. The mind often interprets delay as evidence that nothing is happening, even when growth is quietly unfolding beneath the surface. Frustration grows because expectations insist life should move according to a carefully designed schedule. When reality refuses to follow that timetable, impatience quickly appears. Yet patience is not passive acceptance. It is the discipline of continuing to act wisely without demanding immediate rewards. The Stoics admired this quality because they understood that time often reveals possibilities impossible to recognize in moments of urgency. Waiting becomes less about enduring frustration and more about practicing steadiness while the future gradually unfolds. As this perspective deepens, uncertainty begins losing much of its emotional control. The unknown no longer feels like an enemy that must be defeated before peace can exist. Instead, it becomes a natural part of every meaningful pursuit. No important relationship begins with guarantees. No worthwhile ambition comes with complete certainty. No significant decision arrives accompanied by absolute proof that everything will succeed. The desire for perfect reassurance slowly gives way to trust in your ability to respond intelligently, regardless of the outcome. Confidence changes its foundation. It no longer depends upon knowing exactly what will happen next. It depends upon knowing that your character will remain intact whatever happens next. Modern psychology often describes this process as reframing, the ability to consciously assign healthier meanings to experiences without denying reality itself. The Stoics practiced the same discipline through careful examination of judgments. They did not encourage people to pretend hardship was pleasant or pain was enjoyable. Instead, they encouraged asking whether the first interpretation was the wisest one available. A setback could become a lesson. A disappointment could become a source of resilience. An obstacle could become training for patience. The event remained exactly the same. Only the perspective changed, yet that change in perspective frequently altered every decision that followed, proving that the emotional weight of an experience depends less upon the event itself than upon the meaning carried forward from it. Eventually, this way of living begins feeling natural. The habits that once produced fear are slowly replaced by habits that produce clarity. The mind still generates thoughts, emotions, and expectations because that is its nature. The difference is that they no longer determine your direction without permission. You notice them, you understand them, then you choose your response with greater intention than before. That quiet discipline changes the quality of everyday life in ways that are almost impossible to measure, yet impossible to ignore. The world outside remains wonderfully unpredictable, filled with moments of beauty, difficulty, uncertainty, and surprise. Yet the world within becomes increasingly stable because its foundation no longer rests upon controlling every circumstance. It rests upon mastering the judgments through which every circumstance is experienced, and that single shift gradually changes not only how reality appears, but also the kind of person you become while moving through it. This is how the mind creates reality. It determines what your attention notices before you even realize you are looking. Someone convinced that opportunities are rare will naturally overlook possibilities because the mind is searching for limitations instead. Someone who believes improvement is possible begins noticing resources, connections, and ideas that were always present but previously ignored. The external world has not changed. Attention has. Modern psychology often refers to this as selective attention. explaining that the brain constantly filters enormous amounts of information according to what it believes is important. The Stoics arrived at the same insight through disciplined observation. They recognized that perception directs attention, and attention quietly directs action. Action is where this invisible process becomes visible. Thoughts influence decisions that seem insignificant in isolation. Waking up a little earlier, starting the difficult conversation instead of avoiding it, practicing 1 more hour after everyone else has stopped, reading another chapter instead of scrolling through distractions, choosing patience instead of immediate anger. None of these moments appear life-changing by themselves. Yet life is rarely transformed by one extraordinary decision. It is transformed through ordinary decisions repeated consistently over months and years. Every small action reinforces a particular identity, and every repeated identity gradually becomes the life others eventually describe as success, confidence, resilience, or wisdom. This is why disciplined perception matters so deeply. The way you interpret today's experience influences tomorrow's behavior. If every obstacle is viewed as proof that you should stop, consistency becomes impossible. If every setback is treated as evidence that growth is occurring, persistence begins feeling natural. The obstacle itself has not changed, only its meaning has changed. Yet that single difference determines whether effort continues or disappears. People often admire someone else's achievements without recognizing the countless invisible interpretations that sustained those achievements long before the results became obvious. What appears to be confidence is often years of choosing constructive meaning over discouraging assumptions. There is another reason this process remains difficult to recognize. Results rarely arrive immediately. Human beings naturally want quick evidence that their efforts are working. When progress feels slow, the mind becomes tempted to abandon the very habits capable of producing meaningful change. The Stoics warned against becoming emotionally attached to immediate outcomes because they understood that many worthwhile rewards mature gradually. A seed does not become a tree because someone demands faster growth. It grows because the right conditions are maintained consistently over time. Character develops in much the same way. Every thoughtful response, every disciplined decision, and every patient action quietly strengthens something that cannot always be measured in the present, but becomes unmistakable in the future. Years later, people often look at the finished result and search for a dramatic explanation. They call it luck. They call it destiny. They call it natural talent or fortunate timing. Rarely do they notice the thousands of ordinary moments that slowly created those outcomes. They do not see the conversations where fear was replaced with courage. They do not see the mornings when discipline defeated comfort. They do not see the evenings spent improving instead of complaining. As Aristotle observed, we are what we repeatedly do. Excellence, then, is not an act, but a habit. Most importantly, they do not see the countless interpretations that quietly encouraged another attempt instead of another excuse. Reality appears to change suddenly, only because the invisible work remained hidden while it was happening. This understanding also removes a common source of frustration. It reminds you that control does not require controlling everything. It requires consistently directing what is actually yours to direct. You cannot decide how others respond to your efforts. You cannot guarantee perfect results. You cannot prevent every disappointment. Yet you can influence the quality of your attention, the meaning you assign to events, and the actions that naturally follow from those meanings. Those choices may appear small in a single moment, but they accumulate with extraordinary power. Every disciplined response becomes another vote for the person you are becoming. Eventually, you stop waiting for motivation to transform your life because you recognize that motivation has never been the foundation. Understanding becomes the foundation. Clear perception becomes the foundation. Purposeful action becomes the foundation. The desire to create a different future is no longer dependent upon temporary emotion. because it is supported by daily practice. Reality begins changing not because the world suddenly rearranges itself in your favor, but because your mind consistently notices better possibilities, chooses wiser responses, and remains committed when easier paths invite surrender. The future that once appeared distant is quietly constructed through countless present moments, each shaped by disciplined perception followed by disciplined action. That is how reality is created in the deepest sense, not through fantasy, not through blind optimism, but through the steady partnership between a clear mind and consistent effort, repeated long enough for invisible choices to become visible results. Perhaps the greatest freedom a person can discover is not the freedom to control every circumstance, but the freedom to choose the quality of mind brought into every circumstance. Life has never promised predictable outcomes. It has never guaranteed fairness, certainty, or permanent comfort. Unexpected losses still arrive. Plans still change. People still misunderstand one another. Time still carries away things we hoped would remain. These realities belong to every human life, regardless of intelligence, wealth, or preparation. Yet within those realities exists something that cannot be taken away unless it is surrendered willingly. The ability to refine the mind that meets each experience. The Stoics understood that this inner work was not separate from everyday life. It was everyday life. Every ordinary moment became another opportunity to strengthen judgment instead of impulse, understanding instead of assumption, and intention instead of habit. This means that every difficult conversation carries two experiences at once. There is the conversation itself, and there is the interpretation unfolding inside your mind while the conversation takes place. Someone disagrees with you, someone criticizes your decision, someone fails to recognize your effort. None of those moments automatically determine your emotional state. They simply provide the conditions in which your perception begins working. One interpretation says you are being attacked. Another sees an opportunity to understand another perspective. One interpretation demands immediate defense. Another chooses patience because clarity is more valuable than proving a point. The external event remains exactly the same. What changes is the meaning attached to it, and that meaning quietly shapes every response that follows. The same pattern appears whenever life refuses to follow your expectations. Plans collapse despite careful preparation. Progress arrives more slowly than hoped. Opportunities disappear without explanation. In those moments, the mind naturally begins searching for a conclusion. Sometimes it decides that effort is pointless. Sometimes it convinces you that failure defines your future. Sometimes it whispers that nothing will ever improve because one disappointment has been mistaken for a permanent reality. Those conclusions often feel convincing because they arrive during emotionally difficult moments. Yet emotions are not always reliable interpreters of truth. They reflect the experience of the moment, not necessarily the reality of the future. Learning to recognize that difference protects the mind from building permanent beliefs upon temporary feelings. The Stoics believed that character is not revealed only during extraordinary moments. It is shaped continuously through ordinary choices repeated day after day. Every time patience replaces anger, character is strengthened. Every time honesty is chosen over convenience, character grows quietly. Every time fear appears and wisdom still guides the next step, another foundation stone is placed beneath a stronger life. These moments rarely attract attention because they seem too small to matter. Yet identity is not created through isolated achievements. It is created through repeated decisions that eventually become habits, and habits slowly become the person reflected back to you over time. The direction of life changes long before the destination becomes visible. This is why the thoughts you accept deserve careful attention. Every thought is an invitation, but not every invitation deserves acceptance. Some thoughts encourage courage, others encourage avoidance. Some remind you of your values, Others tempt you toward resentment, comparison, or hopelessness. As Marcus Aurelius reminded himself, the happiness of your life depends upon the quality of your thoughts. The mind generates possibilities constantly, yet wisdom begins with recognizing that thoughts are visitors rather than rulers. They arrive without permission, but they do not have to receive permanent residence. The stories repeated most often gradually become familiar, and familiarity has a quiet way of disguising itself as truth. If the same discouraging narrative is repeated every day, it eventually begins feeling like an accurate description of reality instead of a habit that has simply never been questioned. The stories people tell themselves are often more influential than the circumstances surrounding them. Someone repeatedly says they are always unlucky, and soon every setback becomes further confirmation. Another quietly believes growth is always possible, and each difficulty becomes another lesson instead of another defeat. Neither person is denying reality. They are assigning different meanings to it. Those meanings influence confidence, persistence, emotional resilience, and ultimately behavior. Over months and years, those behaviors produce different outcomes, making it appear as though life has favored one person over another. In truth, life responded differently because each person consistently responded differently to life. The invisible story eventually became visible through action. There is something deeply reassuring about recognizing this process because it returns attention to the place where meaningful influence has always existed. The mind often becomes exhausted trying to control people, predict outcomes, or eliminate uncertainty. None of those efforts can ever be completed perfectly because the world continues changing. Yet refining perception is always available. You can practice greater patience today. You can question an old assumption today. You can choose a thoughtful response instead of an impulsive reaction today. These choices may seem ordinary, but they gradually reshape the way every future experience is approached. Instead of waiting for life to become easier, you become wiser in the way you meet life as it already is. Over time, this discipline begins producing a quiet confidence that does not demand constant reassurance from the outside world. Approval becomes pleasant but unnecessary. Success becomes meaningful without becoming the foundation of identity. Failure becomes informative without becoming a personal definition. As Seneca wrote, "He who is brave is free." Even uncertainty loses much of its power because confidence is no longer built upon predicting every outcome. It is built upon trusting your ability to respond with clarity regardless of what unfolds. This kind of confidence rarely announces itself loudly. It appears in calm decisions, measured words, and the willingness to remain steady while others are consumed by reaction. It grows almost unnoticed because its roots reach deeper than circumstance. Eventually, you begin realizing that the world itself has not fundamentally changed. There are still obstacles, disappointments, unexpected opportunities, and moments of joy mixed together as they have always been. The profound difference is that unconscious perception no longer determines the quality of your experience without your awareness. You begin choosing which thoughts deserve your attention, which stories deserve continuation, and which judgments deserve revision. That choice gradually redirects the course of your life, not through dramatic miracles or sudden transformation, but through countless ordinary moments guided by greater awareness than before. The person you become is shaped one interpretation at a time, one decision at a time, one thoughtful response at a time, until the life you experience reflects not merely the events that happened to you, but the wisdom with which you learned to meet them. The life you experience is shaped far less by what happens to you than by the meaning you choose to give it. Every thought you question, every judgment you refine, and every moment you meet with wisdom instead of impulse becomes another quiet step toward lasting freedom. That is